My name is Celeste, and I was 31 years old the week my father was buried, and my sister changed the locks on the farmhouse where I grew up.
She didn't call to tell me.
I found out when I drove up the following Saturday to collect some of my father's things, and my key didn't work. Renata was standing on the porch when I knocked, and she looked at me with an expression that was almost patient, and she said, "Daughters who left don't get to come back and claim things, Celeste. You made your choice. The farm stays with the people who stayed." I stood there for a moment. I looked at the door. I looked at the fields behind her, 214 acres of bottomland in Grover County, Tennessee, the same fields I had watched my father work every season of my childhood. And then I said, "All right," and I walked back to my car. What Renata didn't understand, what nobody in that family understood, was that my father had been thinking about this question for much longer than any of us knew. And he had not left the answer to chance. The reading was scheduled for the following Thursday. I showed up. The Whitmore farm sat on 214 acres of bottomland in Grover County, Tennessee, about 9 miles outside a small town called Carver's Bend. The land had been in my family since my great-grandfather broke it in the early 1930s, and it had the quality that certain pieces of land develop over generations of work, a settled, purposeful look, as though the fields themselves knew what they were for. The soil in the bottomland was dark and deep and grew soybeans and winter wheat exceptionally well. There was a woodlet on the eastern edge that my father left deliberately untouched. There was a pond in the northwest corner where he had taught both Renata and me to fish on Saturday mornings, with the patience of a man who understood that patience was itself the lesson. My father, Gerald Whitmore, was 67 when he died. He had farmed that land for 42 years, taking it over from his own father at 25 and working it with the methodical, unhurried competence of someone who had grown up understanding that farming was not a romantic occupation but a technical one, a continuous negotiation between what the land could do and what the weather would allow. He kept records of every growing season going back to 1986. He maintained his equipment with a discipline that made his neighbors shake their heads in admiration. He was not a man who talked about feelings readily, but he communicated affection through proximity and attention, and anyone who paid attention could read it. He had 2 daughters. I was the younger by 4 years. My sister Renata was 35 when our father died, capable, practical, and deeply, genuinely invested in the farm in a way that I think was real and not performance. She had stayed in Grover County. She had married a man named Todd Hargrove who had grown up 3 towns over and worked in agricultural equipment sales. They had built a house on the northeastern corner of the farm property 8 years earlier, on a parcel my father had informally set aside for that purpose. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who called my father Papa and who could be found at the farmhouse most Saturday afternoons. Renata helped with the books. She handled the crop insurance renewals. She drove my father to his medical appointments in the last 2 years of his life. These were not small things. I want to be fair to Renata because this story only makes sense if you understand what it cost her, what she had built, what she believed she had earned, and why she was so certain, standing on that porch, that she was right. I left Grover County at 18 for a scholarship to the University of Tennessee's Agricultural Sciences program, which I completed in 4 years and which most people in my family treated as a pleasant, but ultimately impractical detour. I did not come back to Grover County after graduation. I took a position with a regional agricultural cooperative in Knoxville, working in crop management and soil science consulting, and I built a career there that was methodical and unglamorous, and that I loved with a straightforwardness I could never entirely explain to people who hadn't done it. I spent my days driving between farms across 3 counties, pulling soil cores, running nutrient analyses, advising growers on input decisions and rotation strategies. I was good at it. I made a reasonable living. I owned a small house in Knoxville that I'd bought at 28 with a down payment I'd saved over 4 years. I came home to Grover County for holidays. I called my father every Sunday. We talked about the weather, about the crop prices, about what the soil samples from the south field were showing. He would read me numbers off his record sheets, and I would tell him what I thought they meant, and he would tell me what he already suspected, and we would compare notes, and the conversation would end with him saying, "All right then," in the tone that meant he was satisfied, and we would hang up. I knew my father well. I knew how he thought. I knew that he had a particular relationship with fairness, Not sentiment, not preference, but a working farmer's understanding that things should reflect the actual situation on the ground. I also knew that he was a man who thought carefully before he acted and did not revise decisions once he had made them. In the spring of what would turn out to be the last full year of his life, my father had a series of conversations with his estate attorney, a woman named Margaret Celeste who operated a solo practice in Carver's Bend and who had handled his affairs for 20 years. I didn't know about these conversations at the time. My father didn't mention them on our Sunday calls. He mentioned a lot of things on our Sunday calls, the south field, the equipment, the insurance, but not this. What I knew was what he had told me, once, on a Sunday evening in October, in the same tone he used for crop data. I've been thinking through the paperwork, making sure things are set up right. I asked if he needed anything from me. He said no, he had it handled. He said, "Margaret knows what I want. I've been clear with her." I said okay. He said all right then, and we moved on to talking about the winter wheat. I did not know, until the reading, exactly what he had been clear about. My father died on a Wednesday morning in early March. His heart, which had been giving him warnings for 2 years, stopped while he was in his barn doing the kind of early morning walkthrough he had done every day of his farming life. He was found by Todd, Renata's husband, who came over at 7:30 as he often did. The paramedics said he likely hadn't suffered. I drove to Grover County that afternoon. The drive was 3 hours. I cried for the first 40 minutes and then stopped and spent the rest of the drive thinking about soil moisture readings, which sounds strange, but was the kind of involuntary mental retreat that grief sometimes produces in people who work with data. The next 4 days were what they are in farming families, full and practical and collective. There were arrangements to make, people to call, food appearing at the door, neighbors stopping by to pay respects. Renata managed most of it with the efficiency I had always associated with her, and I was grateful for that efficiency even while I also felt, on the edges of those days, a kind of invisibility that was familiar. It was not dramatic. No one said anything unkind to me that week. I was not excluded from the funeral or the gathering afterward. I helped where I was able. I sat with my father's sister, my Aunt Patricia, who had come from Memphis and who held my hand during the graveside service without speaking, which was exactly right. I did not feel unwelcome at my father's funeral. What I felt, underneath all of it, was a low-grade awareness that the question of the farm was present in the room even when no one was saying it, that every conversation between Renata and Todd, every quiet exchange between my mother and Marcus Webb, my father's farm manager, had a current running underneath it that was about the land and what would happen to it. My mother, Diane Whitmore, had retired to a small house in Carver's Bend proper 4 years earlier, after her own health made managing the farmhouse difficult. She and my father had remained close in that particular way of long-married people who have lived in the same county their entire lives. She was in her mid-60s, gentle and somewhat passive by temperament, the kind of woman who genuinely believed that conflict was a problem to be managed rather than a thing to be had. She deferred to Renata on practical matters in the way that she had, I think, been deferring to Renata for years. On the Saturday after the funeral, 5 days after my father died, I drove to the farmhouse to collect some personal things my father had said were mine, a set of his record books going back to the 1980s, which he had once told me on the phone he was keeping for me, a cast-iron pot that had been his mother's, 2 photographs that had hung in his study. My key didn't work. I stood at the front door for a moment with my key in my hand, trying it twice, before I accepted that the lock had been changed. Then I knocked. Renata opened the door. She was dressed practically, in work clothes, with her hair pulled back. She looked at me, without surprise. "The lock's been updated," she said. "I can see that," I said. "I came to get Dad's record books and a few other things." "I figured you'd want some things," she said. "I've set aside some personal items. The record books are in the barn office. Todd's been using them for the operations handover, so we'll need to figure out a time that works." I looked at her. "The operations handover. Marcus is transitioning out by the end of the month," she said. "We're taking over direct management. It makes sense. Todd knows the operation. The kids are here. We're already on site." "Renata," I said. "Dad's estate hasn't been settled yet." "I know that," she said. Her voice was patient, not unkind. patient in the way of someone who has thought through a conversation in advance and knows what shape they want it to take. But the farm doesn't stop operating because we're waiting on paperwork, Celeste. The spring planting decisions have to happen in the next 6 weeks. Someone has to be here, making them.
Someone, I said.
She looked at me with the expression I had seen on her face at various points in our lives, not contemptuous, not cruel, but settled in its conviction in a way that left no visible gap for a different view. You live in Knoxville, she said. You have your job there, your house. You built your life there, and that's fine, nobody's saying it isn't. But daughters who left don't get to come back and claim things, Celeste. You made your choice a long time ago. The farm stays with the people who stayed. I absorbed that. I looked past her at the kitchen behind her, at the table where I had eaten breakfast for the first 18 years of my life, at the window above the sink where my father had always stood to look at the fields while his coffee brewed. I'll be at the reading Thursday, I said. That's fine, she said. That's your right. I walked back to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. Something had gone very still in the center of my chest, not grief, not anger, but the particular quality of stillness that settles in when you understand exactly what situation you are in. I called Margaret Solis from the car. Her assistant answered. I said I wanted to confirm Thursday's appointment and to let Miss Solis know that I would be attending the reading. The assistant confirmed the time, 10 o'clock, at Margaret's office in Carver's Bend. I drove back to Knoxville. I did not stop for dinner. I was not hungry. In the days between that Saturday and the Thursday reading, I learned, in pieces, the shape of what Renata had already put in motion. Todd had met with Marcus Webb, my father's farm manager of 11 years, on the Thursday after the funeral. The conversation, as Marcus described it to me when I called him on Sunday, had been professional and not unfriendly. Todd had explained that the family was planning to transition management in-house and that Marcus's contract, which ran through the end of April, would not be renewed. Marcus was philosophical about it. He said Todd seemed to know what he was doing. He said, Renata's been involved in the operation for a long time, Celeste. I think she figures she's got it covered. He paused and then said, I always thought your dad might have had different ideas, but that's the will for. On Monday, I learned from my mother, not from Renata, that Todd had already been in contact with the farm's primary lender about transitioning the operating line of credit to their names. My mother mentioned it in the tone of someone reporting a logistical detail, not realizing she was telling me something that implied the outcome of Thursday's reading had, in Renata and Todd's minds, already been settled. Mom, I said carefully, the estate hasn't been read yet. I know, honey, she said. But Renata and Todd have been so hands-on and they're right there, she trailed off. I'm sure it'll all be clear on Thursday. It would, I thought. It would be very clear. I did not sleep well the 2 nights before the reading. Not from anxiety, something else, the specific alertness of a person waiting for a thing they know is coming. Margaret Solis's office occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian on the main street of Carver's Bend. The building was old and well-kept and smelled of wood and something faintly floral, and the waiting area had the particular quality of small-town professional offices that have been in operation for a very long time. Slightly dated furnishings, framed local watercolors, a receptionist named Gail who had clearly worked there for decades and who greeted everyone by name. I arrived at 9:50. I was the first one there. Gail brought me coffee without asking, and I sat in one of the waiting area chairs and looked out the window at the main street of Carver's Bend, which I had looked at from various vantage points for 31 years and which still looked, this morning, exactly like itself: the hardware store, the feed supply, the diner with the hand-lettered specials board. Renata and Todd arrived at 10:05. Renata was in good clothes, not formal, but deliberate, the clothing of someone who had understood the register of the occasion. Todd was in slacks and a button-down, which was as dressed as I had ever seen him on a weekday. He nodded at me when they came in. Renata said morning in the tone of a professional greeting and sat down 2 seats away. My mother arrived shortly after, with my Aunt Patricia, who had extended her stay from Memphis. My mother hugged me. Patricia squeezed my arm. Neither of them said anything about the farm. There was also a man I didn't immediately recognize, heavy-set, in his 60s, in a brown sport coat, who turned out to be Howard Crisp, a longtime neighbor of my father's whose land abutted the Whitmore farm on the western edge. I learned later that my father had named him as a witness to certain documents. He sat quietly with his hat on his knee and did not speak to anyone. Gail showed us into the conference room at 10:15. It was a plain room, long table, 6 chairs, windows facing the side yard where a large oak was just beginning to show its early spring green. Margaret Solis came in immediately after us. Margaret was in her mid-50s, with close-cut gray hair and the efficient, undemonstrative manner of a person who had sat in this kind of room many times and understood exactly what her role in it was. She set a file on the table, greeted each of us briefly by name, offered water, and began. She covered the preliminary matters first, the inventory of the estate, the outstanding operating obligations, the straightforward personal property bequests. My father had left his truck to Todd, his tools to Marcus Webb, his mother's jewelry to my mother. There were small cash bequests to 2 longtime employees and to the Grover County Agricultural Scholarship Fund that my father had quietly supported for 15 years. These were read in the careful, even tone of a professional for whom document language was a working material. Renata's posture across the table was composed. Todd had his hands flat on the table. My mother was looking at her own hands in her lap. And then Margaret turned a page, a deliberate motion, the kind that signals a shift in register, and said, "I want to draw your attention to the final disposition section of the will, which Mr. Whitmore revised in April of last year. This section supersedes the prior version of the document in its entirety." Renata's chin came up. Todd's hands, which had been flat on the table, pressed slightly. Margaret looked at the page. She looked up once, briefly, at the room, with the professional neutrality of someone who has learned not to telegraph outcomes, and then she looked back down and began to read. Margaret Solis read the final disposition section in the same unhurried, precise register she had used throughout. The language was formal, the standard architecture of a properly drafted will, but underneath the legal form, my father's thinking was entirely legible. He had been clear with Margaret. She had been clear on the page. The farm, the 214 acres of bottomland in Grover County, the farmhouse, the outbuildings, the equipment, the operating accounts, was to pass in its entirety to his daughters Celeste and Whitmore, not to be divided between his daughters, not to be held in trust, not to be sold and proceeds split. To me, directly in full. There was a paragraph that followed the bequest, which Margaret read as well. In it, my father had set out in plain language his reasoning. He did not express it as criticism of Renata. He expressed it, instead, in the practical terms of a man who had spent 42 years thinking about soil and yield and long-term stewardship. He wrote that Celeste had the technical training and the professional knowledge to manage the land at the level it required going forward. He wrote that the agricultural landscape of the next generation would demand competence in soil science and crop management that exceeded what a general operator could provide. He wrote that Renata and her family would have right of first refusal on any future sale of the property, and that he trusted his daughters to treat each other with the decency they had been raised to practice. He wrote that this decision had not been made lightly and had not been made recently, that he had been thinking about it for several years and had spent the spring consulting with Margaret to ensure it was documented and executed correctly. He had signed the revised will in April, 11 months before he died, with Howard Crisp present as a witness. Howard Crisp, sitting quietly at the end of the table with his hat on his knee, gave a single nod when his name was read. He had known. He had kept it. Margaret set the document face up on the table. She said, in the same measured tone, "This revision was properly executed, witnessed, and notarized. It represents Mr. Whitmore's final and binding instructions regarding the disposition of the farm property." The room was quiet. Renata's face had gone through something while Margaret was reading. I watched it happen without meaning to. It started as a small tightening around her eyes, moved to a stillness in her jaw, and arrived at a blankness that was different from her usual composed expression. Something underneath the composure had shifted, and the face above it hadn't fully reconfigured yet. She looked like a person who had walked into a familiar room and found the furniture in completely different positions. Todd had gone pale in the specific way that men go pale when something financial has changed suddenly and irreversibly. Not flushed, not dramatic, but a draining of color that started at the forehead and moved downward. His hands were no longer flat on the table. They were in his lap. My mother made a small sound. Not a word, just a breath released in a particular way that meant she was processing something she hadn't expected. Patricia, beside her, put a hand on her arm. Howard Crisp continued to sit quietly, which was entirely consistent with everything I had ever known about Howard Crisp. I looked at the document on the table. I looked at my father's signature at the bottom of the final page, the same signature I had watched him write on check stubs and equipment invoices my entire life, plain and unadorned and entirely itself. Margaret said, "Celeste, I have a full copy for your records, and I'd like to schedule some time with you this week to walk through the operational details and the transition steps." "Yes," I said. "Thank you."
My voice was steady.
I was not performing steadiness. It was simply what was available to me in that moment. Something in me had gone very quiet, the way fields go quiet after a hard rain when the work of absorption is happening underground. Renata said after a long moment, "I'd like to review the document." Margaret said, "Of course." She provided a copy. The reading concluded. Margaret thanked everyone for coming and said she was available by phone for questions. The room began to empty in the uncoordinated way that rooms empty after information has arrived that requires private processing. I stayed to confirm the follow-up appointment with Margaret. When I walked out to the waiting area, Renata was standing near the door with Todd's hand on her back, talking to my mother in a low voice. She looked up when I came through. We looked at each other. I said, "I'll be in touch this week about the transition." She said, "Okay." Her voice was flat and careful, and she was working very hard to keep it that way. I thanked Gail for the coffee. I walked out into the March morning on the main street of Carver's Bend and stood for a moment in the pale early spring light. Then I drove to the diner 2 blocks over, ordered eggs and toast, and sat by the window and watched the street. The week that followed was one of the strangest of my life, not because of what happened dramatically, but because of the particular texture of things falling into a different shape. My first call that afternoon was to Marcus Webb. I told him that the farm had passed to me and that I hoped he would be willing to stay on through the transition, longer, if it worked for him. There was a pause on his end. Then he said, "Well, your dad always did know what he was doing." His voice had something in it that was almost satisfaction. He said yes. The follow-up meeting with Margaret Solis 2 days later was detailed and practical. She walked me through the estate documents, the operational accounts, the outstanding obligations, the equipment inventory. My father had kept everything in extraordinary order. His records, which I had been trying to retrieve from the farmhouse the Saturday Renata changed the locks, were exactly where he had always kept them, indexed by year, annotated in his own hand, precisely the resource I would need to understand the operation I was now responsible for. Margaret also mentioned, quietly, that the bank contact Todd had initiated about the operating line of credit transition had been flagged internally once the will was filed. The bank had put the inquiry on hold pending estate settlement. It had not gone through. The operating accounts remained, as they had been structured since my father first opened them, in the name of Whitmore Farm. Todd called me on the Wednesday after the reading. His message was professional. He said he understood the situation had changed, and he wanted to make sure the transition happened in a way that didn't disrupt the spring planting, given that decisions needed to be made in the next few weeks. It was a reasonable call. It acknowledged the reality, without quite acknowledging what had preceded it. I called him back and said I appreciated the call and agreed that the planting decisions were the priority, and that I'd be in Grover County the following weekend and would like to sit down with him and Marcus together. We had that meeting. It was not easy. There was a specific kind of awkwardness that comes from reconfiguring a relationship around a new set of facts, but it was functional. Todd knew the operation. His knowledge was real, and it was useful, and I told him so plainly because it was true. We talked about the planting rotation, the equipment schedule, the labor needs for the season. By the end of 2 hours, we had a working plan. What we did not talk about that day was anything else, and I think that was right. Renata and I did not speak for 3 weeks after the reading. The first time we did, she called me on a Sunday evening, the same time I had always called my father, and I am not sure if that was deliberate or not. Her voice on that call was different from any register I had heard from her in a long time. Stripped of the composed efficiency. Quieter. She said, "I need to understand something. Did you know? Before Thursday?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "I knew Dad had been thinking carefully about the paperwork," I said. "He told me that much. He didn't tell me what he'd decided." A silence. "I thought it was mine," she said. Not accusatory, just the plain statement of someone describing a belief they had held for a very long time. "I've been here for 15 years. I've been doing the books for 8. I thought," she stopped. "I thought he saw that."
He did see it, I said.
And I believed that. He saw it and he said so in the document. The right of first refusal, that was for you. He wanted you to have that security. "It's not the same thing." "No," I said. "It isn't." Another silence. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," I said. "I want you to know that. I'm going to need help running this farm, real help from someone who knows it. I'd like that to be you if you want it to be." She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice had shifted again. Less stripped, less raw, but still not the composed Renata of the porch. "Let me think about it," she said. I said okay. We ended the call. My mother called 3 times in those weeks. Each call was a negotiation between her genuine distress over the disruption to the family and her equally genuine inability to say clearly what she wanted to happen. In one call, she mentioned that Renata and Todd had been under a lot of financial pressure recently, that the equipment loan on their house parcel was more significant than I might realize, and she said it in the careful tone of someone who is not quite asking for something but wants the person they're talking to understand the context. "I understand, Mom," I said.
And I did.
I had looked at the farm's financials thoroughly by then, and I understood exactly what the farm was worth and what it could support and what the realistic options were. In late April, I made a formal proposal to Renata and Todd, a 10-year lease arrangement on the residential parcel where their house stood at a below-market rate, in exchange for Renata taking on a formal operational management role on the farm with a salary. It was not charity. The farm needed her knowledge, and the arrangement made financial sense on both sides. I asked her to have it reviewed by her own attorney before responding. She called me 2 weeks later.
She said yes.
"We have not fully found our way back to each other. That is a longer process than a lease agreement can accomplish, and I am not sure what it will look like when it arrives." But she showed up on the first morning of spring planting with her clipboard and her efficiency intact, and she walked the rows alongside Marcus and talked through the rotation adjustments I had proposed based on the soil data, and she said once, without looking at me, "Dad would have liked this rotation." I said I thought so too. My father was not a man who explained himself at length. He said what he needed to say and let the rest be understood from the work and the record and the decisions he made and kept. He told me once, when I was maybe 16 and trying to understand why he rotated certain fields a particular way, that good farming was mostly about paying attention to what was already there, reading what the soil was telling you, watching what the weather was doing, and making your decisions from what was actually in front of you rather than what you wished were in front of you. I have thought about that a lot in the months since the reading. He paid attention. He watched both his daughters for 30 years, and he read the situation clearly, and he made his decision from what was actually there, not from sentiment, not from convention, not from the path of least resistance, and he wrote it down in plain language and had it witnessed by Howard Crisp and filed it with Margaret Solis and trusted that the document would do what documents do when the right room arrives. He was right. The document did exactly that. I think the lesson is not that staying away pays off, or that loyalty to a place is worth less than credentials, or any other version of the story that makes it a morality play with sides. The lesson is simpler and more demanding than that. The people who see us clearly, who watch the actual work, the actual choices, the actual quality of attention we bring to things, those people are worth being known by. And being known by them is, in the end, a form of protection that no one can anticipate and no one can take back. That's my story. 214 acres of bottomland in Grover County, a farm manager named Marcus who already knew, and one final page that my father had Margaret write very carefully in a law office in Carver's Bend on an afternoon in April when I was in Knoxville pulling soil cores and had no idea any of it was happening. Here's the question I keep sitting with, and I genuinely want to know what you think. If a parent decides to leave something significant to one child over another, not because they loved one less, but because they saw something specific in how each one lived, do you think that's fair? Do you think fairness and love even belong in the same calculation? Because I have turned that question over 100 times since March, and I still don't have a clean answer. Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.